this is festive. Yeah, I tried to get it to go on a solid color setting, but unfortunately it's only this or seizures. There is no in between. No, but donning this gay apparel seems pretty appropriate, seeing as today we're talking about something pretty wild. Books. We're just talking about the last 5 books I've read or attempted to read. So we're gonna start with this beaut that tells us all about the beasts we really are. It's called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, or you might know it better by its other title, Eine kurze Geschichte der Welt, which is how I learned about it when I was roaming the streets of Germany. Mothers, fathers, daughters were reading this book, and eventually I got my hands on it. And you know, at first I was pretty worried it was just gonna be chock full of boring information, but it's not your grandmother's history book. So I'm about 22 pages into this thing, and I've already learned like so many interesting conversation starters at parties. Which really, why else do you read? One of the interesting things I learned from this book was that humans' heads were growing in size around the time that they started to stand erect. And when they started to stand, your hips need to get narrower. And so this was harder on mothers, right? Because the longer they got into their pregnancy, the more likely they were to die during childbirth, right? There were no hospitals back in the day. No epidural. Life or death situation, literally. So as evolution moved human birth to be earlier and earlier, human children were coming out less developed. Like an elephant pops out of the womb and it's ready to walk. A giraffe pops out and I don't know what happens because I've never seen a giraffe pop out. But essentially, like when human kids pop out, we're like potato sacks, right? Somebody's got to care for us for years. And so that's essentially what this book is trying to do, is explain how life is today and why it is that way. 22 pages in and mind already blown. If you want any more info, you gotta buy the book. Speaking of which, I usually almost never buy my books, and that's why I have no more books to show you, because they've all gone back to the library. I guess we're gonna have to rely on the ancient art of oral storytelling. To get the point across. So last book I had went back to the library way too soon. It was Oliver Twist. Now this book I have tried to start too many times. Yes, I've tried to start it 2 times and that was too many. For whatever reason, Charles Dickens can just not hold my attention. I always like his books when I'm done with them, but it's like going to a museum, right? It's like, I really don't want to be here. I really don't want to be here. And after you go home, you're like, wow, I really learned a lot from that. That's kind of like what Oliver Twist was to me both of these times. Now, granted, I've only got through the first 40 pages, so maybe there's more of it I need to learn, but I'm of the opinion if you don't want to finish a book, you don't have to. Set it down, move on with your life, maybe you'll come back to it. Oh, good transition, because that's exactly what I did with The Handmaid's Tale. I actually really did like The Handmaid's Tale when I started it the first time 3 years ago, but again, the library is a demanding mistress, and she wanted her book back before I could finish it. So this past year I picked it up again, and compliments to the chef, that book is awesome. This book is essentially about a dystopia in which women's bodies have been relegated solely to the purpose of baby making. Not as fun as it sounds. They strip away all the unnecessary men in the society, and the only men who can procreate with these women are the commanders, are these men of superior rank. And basically all of them are sterile, and if a woman can't have a baby by the man, she is considered to be unwoman and sent to a place in society where she's most likely going to die. You know, or not necessarily where she's going to die, but where she will have to do hard manual labor for most likely the rest of her pathetic existence on Earth. So that is not as much of a Debbie Downer as you think. Quite interesting, and the ending is a shocker. I've never seen a book end like that before, is all I'm gonna say. Now, where The Handmaid's Tale was a book that was hard to put down, another book I read that was relatively easy, but maybe not as like, oh my god, I need to read this now, was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou essentially recounts her time growing up as a black female in the South. There are parts in it that make me absolutely disgusted to be a human being, and there are other parts of it that are like, holy cow, crazy. Like there's one story where she's trying to get out of Mexico, driving her drunk dad in the back of a stick shift, and she's like 14 years old. I can't remember how old, but she is not old enough to be driving. Essentially, the whole book is this like disjointed collection of stories from her life, which is more or less what the human condition is, right? Going from one part to another, and that's essentially how we become the human beings we are. I think I actually had read that book before, but I hadn't remembered, because as I kept reading it, I was like, huh, this sounds oddly familiar. So if that gives you a sense, it's one of those books that makes for good, easy reading, but is also gonna challenge you to think about society. Not the kind of book where you pick it up and you're like, oh my god, I can't stop, but also not a book that you stay away from. So I'll let you make of that what you will. Now, one of those books that you, oh my gosh, can't stay away from once you get started was Dan Brown's Digital Fortress. Now, this was the earliest of the 5 books that I've read, so excuse me if I've forgotten some details. Actually, I've forgotten all the details, but you know how Dan Brown writes? Essentially, reading a book of his is like watching an action movie. I mean, the whole time you're on the edge of your seat just wondering who's gonna die, who's not gonna die, what's gonna get figured out, and when. So Digital Fortress essentially has the same vibe, except it is centered around a controversy at the NSA. Purely fictional, purely awesome. I can't remember most of it, but I did want to give it its due, because usually the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons get a lot more press, but Digital Fortress I picked up in a day and had it down in a day. It was that good. That snappy. So anyway, now you got a new handful of books to choose from. Knock yourself out. I'm sure the more you read, the more your friends will think you're the brightest bulb in the pack.